Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of our How to Start a Sourdough Starter series. Thank you, Jesus. It is another beautiful day to be in the kitchen, and today is a very exciting day because you've been feeding your starter, you've been watching it, you've been babying it. Well, today it's time to learn how to use your starter. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Today we will be making a loaf of sourdough bread using our new sourdough starter that we learned how to make in our How to Start a Starter series. That's what's coming up today, so stay tuned. Now, I went over my tools for the trade, things that you'll need. I went over that in my previous video, so don't forget to check it out. So you'll see some of the things that I will be using, and I'll be showing you some of those things as I go along, but that video kind of shows you exactly what tools you will need to begin your journey as a sourdough baker. So I've already gone over that. We already know about the starter. We know about the tools. Now it's time to roll up our sleeve and start mixing sourdough. That's what I'm going to do. So to start off, the first thing we need to do, of course, we need our scale. And I'm going to go ahead and add my water into my bowl. And I'm just going to use a regular bowl here. No need for anything fancy. So I know I need 285 grams of water. Now, you know what I always say, don't add all the water in. So I'm going to add 260 grams of water. And if I need those other 15 grams, I'll use them. If I don't, then no harm done. So into the bowl, the next thing goes in. I need to add my salt. Now, some bakers don't like to add the salt in at this point. Some bakers prefer to wait and add the salt in once the dough has relaxed a little bit. That's called auto-lacing. You can do an auto-lace if you want. You would just leave the salt out and then mix the water and the flour and let it sit, and before you add in the sourdough starter and the salt. I have never had much fun with auto-lacing, not this kind of dough. So I'm just going to jump right into it. But if you want to auto-lace, you can totally do that. So I'm going to go ahead and add into my water, add my salt. Now I am using pink Himalayan salt. This is very important. You can use regular salt. You can even use table salt. However, I would suggest that you stay away from regular salts and table salt because table salt can kind of do some funny things with your starter. And plain salt or kosher salt is plain. It doesn't have any minerals in it. Pink Himalayan salt has 84 minerals, which really jumpstart your sourdough. It feeds the starter that's in your sourdough. It feeds it with all kinds of good things. If you do a side-by-side comparison of a finished loaf made with pink Himalayan salt or just regular salt, you'll see the pink Himalayan salt has a more open crumb and the texture is just beautifully. So I always use pink Himalayan salt. Now let's just go ahead and give our bowl a swirl to dissolve the salt. To the water with the salt, we are going to go ahead and add in our flour. So I'm using two types of flour in this recipe. So the first flour we're going to use is bread flour. And since we're baking bread, we need that higher protein flour. So I'm going to use bread flour. You can use all-purpose flour, but your dough will be a little bit more lax than if you use bread flour. It won't have the structure because there's not enough protein in all-purpose flour as it is in bread flour. And I talked about the various flours in my Let's Chat About Flour series. You can go and check that out. And it tells you all about, well, not all, but some about the various flours and their usefulness. So I know I need 300 grams of bread flour. So 300 grams, 301 grams to be exact. And we also need some whole wheat flour. You can leave this out. You can use all-purpose bread flour if you want to. However, I like to add some whole wheat flour to it because the whole wheat will help your dough be more sour because it takes longer for dough with whole wheat in it to develop versus just plain bread flour or all-purpose flour. It takes a little longer, but it's worth it because your bread is more sour and it has more flavor, way more flavor. So I'm going to add in, I know I need 69 grams. And by the way, the recipe will be in the description box below. 69, spot on. Okay, so those are the flours. We are done with those. And by the way, my dad bought me these. These are very good. And this is not compost, it's flour. So my dad bought me those and I use them and they're perfect for storing flour because they're metal. Food safe metal, by the way, not just any metal jug. So the last thing we need to add to this is our sourdough starter. Now this I fed last night. This is your leavening because at this point you can mix this all together and you just have some unleavened bread. So here is our leavening that we need to leaven our bread. And I'm going to go ahead and add this. I like to make just a little teeny well in the middle. And then just add this in. And you can see what I mean about these dough scrapers. It just takes it right out. You don't even have to think about it. It scrapes it right out. Cleans your bowl. Because all of this is part of your recipe. So you don't want to waste any of it. If you start losing bits of this, you're losing bits of your leavener. And this is measured out to suit however many loaves of bread you're baking. So if you were baking, this is for 1 loaf. If you were baking 10 loaves, you would have a larger amount of sourdough starter. So we are done with the scale. We can put it away, put it in the drawer, put it away and forget about it. Now comes the elbow grease part of it and the Danish dough whisk, which helps us keep our fingers nice and tidy. So this is the actual mixing process. So just mix and mix and mix. Now, you may say, oh, it's very, very dry, but keep mixing. Don't add the liquid into there just yet because we may not need it. We may. Okay. This is looking fairly good. I might just add just a few drops of water. And I mean just a few, not much. Just a few drops of water right around. Mix it in. Now, the reason why I'm not worried about this looking, it's looking a little dry in some places at this point. The reason why I'm not doing this is because number one, this is your first loaf of sourdough bread. If your dough is very wet, it becomes more challenging to work with. If your dough is very dry, it becomes stubborn to work with. So this is fine. And as it sits here, as you notice, just in those few seconds, it got even wetter looking. So keep working with it and aim for a texture that is neither slack nor stiff and dry. That's why weighing is important. Okay, now look at that. It's already looking a little sticky. Just keep mixing it. And now it's starting to look a proper stickiness. You notice how it's pulling itself away from my dough hook, whereas before it was all messy looking. Now it's actually pulling itself away. So this is the initial mixing stage. And you can keep doing this for a few minutes, but I don't. Once it gets to this point and it's yanking, it's cleaned itself off my dough hook. My dough hook is clean. So I don't need to keep fussing with it. It's mixed. So just take your handy little bench knife, scrape down the sides because you want to make sure you get everything in there. And we are going to set this aside and let this rest for 30 minutes. We're going to cover it and let it rest for 30 minutes. After the 30 minutes, we will begin the series of stretch and folds. which is how you knead the sourdough. Because at this point, we're not using any machines. We're not getting our hands in there. We're not dumping this out on the countertop to start kneading and all those things, which you would do in typical doughs. But as you can see, this is way too sticky to knead. Now, there are bakers who knead this on the countertop, and more power to them, but it's not necessary. And especially with your first dough, if you can contain this and control this in a vessel, and you don't have, stickiness going all over the countertop, keep it in the bowl, and we'll do the stretch and the folds in the bowl. Now, sourdough starter is often referred as a no-knead bread, and that is partly true. But some people mistake no knead for no work, meaning I can just do this and walk away, come back, shape it, put it in the Banneton, put it in the fridge cold proof, dump it in there, and bake, and I'll have just this gorgeous loaf of bread. No, you won't, because your dough won't have any texture, and it won't have any structure because you haven't given it structure. So in lieu of the kneading, which you would traditionally do with your hands, we'll be doing stretch and folds, and that replaces the kneading. It's a lot neater, and for sourdough, it gives you a structure that is unique to sourdough bread, which is why bakers do stretching and folding. So even big bakeries do. I mean, when I say big, I mean locally owned by people, not corporation bakeries. They stretch and fold massive containers of dough, because that's unique to sourdough bread, and it gives it that structure only sourdough bread has and needs. So we're going to set this aside. I am going to set a timer for 30 minutes. We will come back and do the first set of stretch and folds. All right, so 30 minutes is up for the dough. So let's open the lid, and it smells nice. Wow, it smells very weedy. Now, as I say, first things first, take the dough temperature. So I'm just going to plunge it in here, and this will tell me how happy my dough is and where the location that I have it, whether the location is too warm or too cold. So I'm looking at my dough right off the bat, and it is 79 degrees. So that tells me where my dough is sitting, it's a little too warm. So I need to just switch it to another place. Now, you would know that if you didn't use a thermometer. As I said earlier, the ideal temperature is 73 degrees to 76 degrees. So my dough is 3 degrees, a little too warm. That's not anything for me to run and go, oh no, I need to plunge it into some cold water. No, just move it out of that location and I'll set it somewhere else. Now, time to roll up the sleeves and do the first set of stretch and folds. Now here I have a bowl of water. So wet your hands, and you will need this bowl of water all throughout the duration of your working with the dough until you shape it. So keep a bowl of water handy. So wet your hands. They don't have to be sopping wet, but they should be wet. It keeps the dough from sticking to your fingers. Now for this first stretch and fold, we're going to turn the dough clockwise and fold it. So for you, that would be counterclockwise. So pick it up, pick a piece of it up, tuck it in. When it starts to feel sticky, just wet your hands. Pick another piece of it up and fold it over. And another piece, stretch it and fold it over. That's why it's called a stretch and fold. And for the first stretch and fold, it's going to be really, really sticky. So that little bowl of water will become handier than ever. But you want to avoid excessively wet hands because you are adding some liquid to your dough as you do this. As a matter of fact, some bakers count this in, the water that collects in your fingers, they count that in as part of the water weight in your dough. But I don't bother with that. That is really, really high tech for me. So I'm just going to do that around until I get a nice shape for my dough. And then I like to take my hands and do a swooping tuck underneath motion. Swoop and tuck underneath, just like that. what I'm doing is I'm strengthening my dough because I'm forcing it into a ball. And this helps especially if you have a very slack, wet dough. Like say for instance, you added in too much water and you have a slack, wet dough. Do this a couple of times and this will it'll help strengthen your dough and it won't be quite so slack. So you see, we have a nice little bowl of dough. Let me clean my hands off. By the way, don't ever pour this water down the sink drain. I toss it outside. It's full of flour, especially when you're finished, and you don't want that to go down your drain. Same thing with any of your sourdough tools that have dough in them. Rinse them into a small bowl and then throw the water outside or pour it out in an outside drain or something. Don't pour it down your sink or your toilet. That you'll be on best of terms with your plumber if you do. So here is the dough after the first set of stretch and folds. And of course, at this point, the dough isn't rising. It's not doing anything because we're working with it. And so every time we move it, whatever little volume it starts to develop, it goes back down. Now, before we set the dough aside for its next 30-minute rest, I am going to take the dough temperature again. And I just like to wet my thermometer. It goes in a little easier. So remember when we started, it was 79 degrees. Now let's see what the temperature is. It was 79.9, almost 80 degrees. So now the dough is 79.5. So the dough has dropped in temperature a little bit. That's good. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to set this in a different spot for the next 30 minutes. And I'm going to just monitor the temperature just to make sure the temperature doesn't keep climbing. And we'll come back in 30 minutes. Okay, another 30 minutes is up. So it's time to do another set of our stretch and folds. Now this set of stretch and folds is going to be a little different from the first one that we did. So the first one was more like a stretch and tuck. Now we're actually going to start a stretch and fold. Now, the good thing about these bowls that I have is they have grippy feet, so they won't move a lot. But you can always, if you don't have a bowl stabilizer, you can always take a towel and shape it into a little turban like this, and then set your bowl down into it, and that'll kind of stop your bowl from sliding around on the counter because it can slide. But as I say, this bowl has grippy non-skid, grippy, not feet, but a bottom. All right, so just wet your hands, just like in the first, just wet your hands. But this time you're gonna make sure you wet your whole hand, not just your fingers. The first time was mostly your fingers. This time, wet your whole hand. And we're going to grab the dough right in the middle. So grab it and pick it up like that. And if your dough is a good texture, it'll release. If it sticks too much, you need to do a few more of the first set of stretch and tucks. And since this is a little loaf, I just fold it over on itself and then rotate the bowl and do that again. Pick it up, stretch it, allow it to stretch, and fold it just like that. And don't overdo with that, because if you overdo it, the dough will start to tear. Because you're putting a lot of weight on it. You're forcing it to hang by its own weight for a little while. And then just remember to just take your hand, swoop around, and form a nice round ball like that. And that is our second set of 30-minute intervals of stretching and folding. Now, dependent on the bulk amount of dough that you're using, say you're making 3 loaves, I would suggest you do your stretch and folds at 20-minute intervals because you have more dough there. But for this is a single loaf amount, so I'm not going to worry so much because there's enough. 2 per hour is enough. So I'm going to go ahead, make sure you keep yourself on point. I'm going to go ahead and mark off my second for my 30 minutes. So that is an hour. An hour has passed. Now I'm going to repeat the stretch and fold that we just did. I'm going to repeat that for another 2 30-minute intervals of stretch and fold for another hour, and that gives us a total of 2 hours. So just do the same thing, pick it up in the middle, stretch it, fold it, and then rotate it, and then do your strengthening tucks. So cover it back up, set a timer for another 30 minutes. And after the 1 hour, we will put the dough into its resting stage. That is called bulk fermentation. So I'll see you back in 1 hour. Bye-bye.